Chapter 18, the endocrine system. Before we get into the details of the endocrine system, we have to compare and contrast the nervous system to the endocrine system, especially since our last few lectures dealt with the nervous system and its several parts. So the nervous and endocrine systems act together to coordinate all systems of the body. The nervous system releases neurotransmitters, and the endocrine system releases hormones. Now, most hormones circulate throughout the blood and bind to receptors on target cells. So that means that these hormones can travel far and wide. Now, neurotransmitters also bind to receptors on target cells, but they usually act close to the site of release, not like hormones that travel through the entire body. Table 18.1 gives us that comparison. If we look at the characteristics of molecules, for example, the nervous system's neurotransmitters released locally, which means that it is close to the site of release, or the response is close to the site of release. The endocrine system, hormones delivered to tissues throughout the body through the blood. Site of action, close to site of release at the synapse, binds to receptors in postsynaptic membrane, whereas endocrine is far from the site of release. Usually, we do have some other instances with paracrine and autocrine where the hormones are released close to the target cells or the target cell itself, binds to the receptors on or in the target cell. Types of target tissues, nervous system, we're dealing with muscle, remember that neuromuscular junction, gland cells, and other neurons. For the endocrine system, we're talking about pretty much all the cells throughout the body. Time of onset, nervous system is really quick, within a millisecond, so a thousandth of a second. Whereas the endocrine, the hormone release can last seconds, it can last hours, or can even last days. Duration of action, nervous system is brief, and the endocrine system is longer. Now notice we've been talking about endocrine glands. Remember our words. Endo means within. We have talked in the past about exocrine glands and how they differ. So just to keep it pretty simple, endo is going to be hormones that are secreted, or we'll keep it stuff right now until we elaborate on those hormones, stuff that is secreted within the body through the blood. Whereas exo means outside, exocrine glands are going to secrete their products through ducts onto the surface of something, right? So again, for exocrine glands, none of these are hormones. They're secreting watery perspiration or mucus or oil or digestive enzymes. So exocrine glands include sudoriferous glands, which are sweat glands, our sebaceous glands, which are our oil glands. If you think about your scalp and all those oil glands filling those hair follicles with oil, mucus glands, and digestive glands. And there are several other glands throughout the body that we aren't going to really elaborate on, but these are the primary ones here. Now, endocrine glands are completely different. They are not secreting to the outside portion of our body or to surface of tubes. They are secreting hormones. So they do not have ducts. They're going to secrete their products, again, hormones, directly into the interstitial fluid that surrounds them. The hormones diffuse into the bloodstream through capillaries and are going to be carried to the target cells throughout the body. And again, remember, these are receptor specific. So we're going to throw some little tidbits in here that we will elaborate on earlier, but again, something to think about as you think about these hormones traveling through the body, that they are site and or receptor specific. Now, some endocrine glands that we're going to discuss include the pituitary. Now remember, the pituitary will go and branch into anterior and posterior pituitary, so we'll talk about exactly what the difference is between those two. The thyroid, parathyroid, adrenal gland, and pineal gland. Now, there are other organs in the body that are not technically part of the endocrine system, but they do secrete hormones because they contain secreting cells. Now, these secreting cells can be found in organs like the pancreas, the ovaries, the testes, the thymus, the hypothalamus, the kidneys, the stomach, the liver, the small intestine, the skin, heart, adipose tissue, and placenta. So what we can derive here is, look at this list. We're talking about pretty much, 98% of the organs in our abdominal cavity and urogenital cavity, right? And our pelvic cavity. So we're talking about almost everything in our body, including the skin, right? Are secreting a type or types of hormones that are going to act on the body. So this is an important note. So we can use a picture to kind of quickly locate where some of these organs are. If we zoom on into the brain, remember we have our hypothalamus here. Dangling from the hypothalamus is the stalk, this infundibulum. So we'll write in infundibulum, right? That stalk is going to house our pituitary gland. So there's our pituitary gland. If we go to the thalamus, remember we did brain in AP1, above it was the epithalamus. Now, continuous with the epithalamus is going to be the pineal gland. So there's that pineal gland secreting that hormone melatonin. Now we can go into, we'll zoom back out and we'll go into the throat or neck region. We have this butterfly shaped gland that is called the thyroid. Now, on the posterior aspects of the thyroid, we have two on each side, two little areas, so a total of 4. That is the parathyroid. Now, histologically, uniquely, even though they look like they're connected, they're really not. They're more or less neighbors, and that's going to be important when we look at the histology and how they're different. Just superior to the heart, we have another gland. This large gland here is the thymus. So we'll talk about the thymus. We see our skin, lungs, liver, heart, stomach, all hormone secreting organs. We get down into the abdominal pelvic cavity. We have the adrenal glands lying adrenal. So ad means on top of. So top, renal means kidney. Okay, so we have these two glands lying on top of the kidney. Seated in the mesentery, we have this long flag-like structure, the pancreas. We have the small intestines, the kidneys. And lastly, we have our reproductive organs, the testes for male and the ovaries for females. We have a hyperlink that brings us to a slideshow about all the endocrine glands and their locations. If you want to click this and watch that through Wiley, remember you must be connected to the internet and in slideshow mode in order to run this animation. Hormone activity. Now, hormones traveling throughout the body will affect only target cells that possess specific protein receptors for that hormone. Now, that's really important. If we think about it, let's pick a hormone, prolactin, for example, right? We know that prolactin is going to act on the breasts to help stimulate breast milk. Now, that hormone is traveling through the body. We don't want it activating the pancreas or activating the adrenal gland for fight or flight. We don't want it activating the testes. So we have to make sure, in our body's way to ensure that these hormones act as specifically and directly where they need to do the required work was on these protein receptors. So again, remember that the hormones are going to bind to specific protein receptors on specific target cells. Now, these receptors are continually being used and abused, so that means they're being synthesized and broken down. Now we have two scenarios with receptors. Now the receptors can be down-regulated, meaning we can reduce the number of receptors. And we do this when we have high concentrations of hormones. So what we don't want is the cell to be overrun with activity. So when we have high concentrations of hormones, what we do is we down-regulate the number of receptors. Next, we can upregulate the number of receptors, and we do this in the presence of low concentrations of hormones. So what this means is essentially when we have low hormone concentration, the cell can create more protein receptors so that we can utilize the hormone we have to make sure that the cell is being activated and continuing with its activity. So we're going to use a picture to kind of elaborate on hormone activity. So we can tell a lot from this picture. So we're going to jump ahead a little bit, but again, I want you to keep some of these words and definitions in the back of your mind. So what's going on here? Number one, let's write a 1 here. We have an endocrine cell. And that endocrine cell is secreting something, hormones, right? Secreting hormones into the interstitium that's getting put into circulation. Now notice, we're going to classify different types of hormones. A hormone can either be water-soluble or lipid-soluble. Now, what does that mean? Lipid-soluble versus water-soluble. So what can move easily through water and what can move easily through fat, right? So obviously water-soluble is going to move more easily through water, whereas lipid-soluble is going to move more easily through fat. Now, remember, with biology, there's balance. So if something's water-soluble, it's probably going to move through the blood more easy, right? More easily, because the major component of blood is 60% of it's plasma, right? So water. And then the lipid-soluble, it's going to have a difficult time moving through the blood, but it may have an easier time at its target or at its cell. And we'll talk about exactly how in a little bit. So if we look at this picture, we see that this one is just kind of suspended in the blood. It's not attached to anything. So again, jumping ahead, we have a nice water-soluble hormone. So again, we can tell a lot from the pictures. Now it moves through the blood, so that's step 3. So again, step 2 is over here where it was brought out of the cell and into the blood. And then it's going to dissolve out of the capillary and then attached to, so this will be step 4, attached to the target cell. And then again, we are at a distant target. And then once that hormone attaches to the target cell, to that receptor, the cells are now sensitive to that hormone, and the cells are going to be activated to do whatever work or whatever their job. And we're keeping it really simple. We're going to outline what these jobs do, what these cells do, what their job is in a little bit. We're going to continue with hormone activity, and we're going to look at hormones that don't circulate through the blood and act close by to the endocrine cell. So for example, we deal with local hormones. These are called paracrines. An example, and let's look at this picture right here. An example of a paracrine cell would be delta cells in the pancreas. So delta cells in the pancreas release a hormone called somatostatin. So I'll write somatostatin. And the job of somatostatin is to act on the alpha and beta cells of the pancreas to inhibit the secretion of insulin and glucagon. So inside the pancreas, all these cells, alpha, beta, delta, all reside next to each other. And these delta cells are going to release, again, somatostatin. So we'll draw an arrow to this hormone. That's all the somatostatin. It will target the alpha, beta, suppressing the release of insulin and glucagon. The second type that we're going to look at are those that act on the same cell that secretes them, are called autocrine cells. Now this is important. We see this in our immune response with interleukin-1 and cytotoxic T cells. So what happens is this cell is going to secrete a hormone, right? And that hormone, that signaling hormone, is going to bind right back onto itself. Now, typically when the cell does this, what's going to happen is that cell is then going to be activated to do its job. Again, we're just being pretty blunt here, pretty broad, just saying the cell's job. We're not really identifying what that job is. But in this case, the cell's job is going to be to activate mitosis or cell division. So that's typically what, without getting too complicated, typically what these autocrine cells are going to do is going to activate cell division. The next topic about hormones that we're going to cover is hormone activity. Now, we alluded to this before in our little picture where we said that hormones are either lipid-soluble or water-soluble. Now, the lipid-soluble hormones include steroid hormones, thyroid hormones, and nitric oxide hormones. Our water-soluble hormones include our amines, our peptide and protein hormones, and our eicosanoids hormones. Now, remember we said that there's always a balance in biology. So we have to give some to get some. So the question is, where are we giving and getting? So for water-soluble hormones, the ease in these hormones is that they circulate freely in plasma. So where are we going to encounter the difficulty? The difficulty is going to be at the target cell. And we'll use some pictures to explain this. Now, lipid-soluble hormones are going to have the reverse of water-soluble hormones. They're going to have an easy time sliding right into the cell. So think about it. What do lipid-soluble hormones have that make their lives so much easier when it comes to the cell? Well, think about the cell membrane. What's it made of? A phospholipid bilayer. So it's this fatty sandwich that when a fat-soluble hormone comes into contact, it has the ability to slide right in. So the ease is going to be at the target cell. So that means the difficulty is going to be traveling through the blood. So because we have difficulty traveling through the blood, we need a protein, a transport protein specifically, that's going to allow us or help us get lipid-soluble hormones through the blood to their target cells or tissues. Let's look at a table, 18.1, to summarize hormones by their chemical class. So we start with lipid-soluble. First steroid hormone is aldosterone. Okay. Site of secretion is going to be the adrenal cortex. The kidney also secretes a steroid hormone, calcitriol, which is an active form of vitamin D. Testosterone from the testes, estrogen and progesterone from the ovaries. Our thyroid hormones includes triiodothyronine, T3, and thyroxine, T4. Now, when we get into hormones, we don't have to worry about spelling and saying triiodothyronine and thyroxine. We could just say T3 or T4. The next are our thyroid glands. This is what is producing and secreting that T3 and T4, specifically the follicular cells. We can look at gas, nitric oxide. So the site of secretion is going to be endothelial cell lining, blood vessels. Now nitric oxide is a major vasodilator. So when these blood vessels are in the presence of nitric oxide, these blood vessels are blown wide open. Continuing with table 18.2, we could look at some water-soluble hormones like our amines. The examples would be epinephrine or norepinephrine. These are catecholamines. The site of secretion is adrenal gland. Melatonin with the pineal gland, histamine with mast cells, type of white blood cell, and serotonin with the platelets in the blood. Next are peptides and proteins, so all hypothalamic releasing and inhibiting hormone. Now this is the nice thing about hormones, is it's pretty much simple stupid science. So we look at growth hormone releasing hormone, growth hormone inhibiting hormone. So the hormones are typically named after what they do, right? So for those releasing and inhibiting hormones, we're talking about site of secretion being the hypothalamus. And then the posterior pituitary gives us two hormones, oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. The posterior is going to give us 7 growth hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, ACTH or adrenocorticotropic hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, prolactin, and melanocyte stimulating hormone. The pancreas will give us insulin, glucagon, somatostatin, and pancreatic polypeptide with its varying cells. Parathyroid hormone from the parathyroid gland. Calcitonin from the thyroid gland, specifically the parafollicular cells. And we'll differentiate why the thyroid is in a different little section, why the parathyroid below is also a little bit different. We talk about gastrin, secretin, cholecystokinin, GIP from the stomach and small intestine, EPO, erythropoietin for the kidneys, leptin with our fat tissue, prostaglandins and leukotrienes, all cells except red blood cells. We have here another interactive animation. This is the mechanism of hormone action, lipid-soluble versus fat-soluble. Now remember to click on this link and have it work. You must be connected to the internet and in slideshow mode. Mechanisms of hormone action. So responses to the same hormone may vary depending on the hormone itself and the target cell. So a few examples. The response may be synthesis of a new molecule. For example, thyroid-stimulating hormone will be released from the anterior pituitary. It moves through the hypophyseal portal system into the blood, and then will target the thyroid, specifically the follicular cells of the thyroid. And those follicular cells will make a protein called thyroglobulin that will be eventually synthesized into T3 and T4. Another response would be changing the permeability of the cell membrane. Another response would be to stimulate transport of a substance into or out of the cell. We also see altering of the rate of metabolic actions, and we see this with thyroid hormones, right? So T3 and T4 can affect all the different cells of the body, stimulating permeability changes in cell membranes for the uptake of glucose, of sugar, so that cells can do work and provide them with energy, again, increasing metabolism. We can also see a response of being causing the contraction of smooth or cardiac muscle. Let's elaborate on the mechanisms of hormone actions. We're going to start with lipid-soluble hormones that bind to receptors within the target cell. So again, we're going to use pictures to help explain what's going on here. So let's look at our blood vessel, our capillary. We see the hormone. It is being carried through the blood with a transport protein. So right away we know it's lipid-soluble. Remember that give and take. Now once we get to our target, the protein releases the hormone diffuses out, and it slides right into the cell, hence the definition of lipid-soluble. Once there, it's going to bind to the receptors on the nucleus, so activated receptor hormone complex alters gene expression. So as a result, we kick those ribosomes into high gear. This newly formed messenger RNA directs the synthesis of specific proteins on the ribosomes. So once those ribosomes are kicked into gear, go back to AP1 when we talked about all these different organelles and the function of ribosomes to make proteins. The cell is now doing its job. Its job here is to make new proteins. So those new proteins are going to alter the cell's activity. Now that we finished the lipid-soluble hormones, it's time to look at water-soluble hormones. And again, we'll use this picture to explain what's going on. The water-soluble hormones bind to receptors on the exterior surface of the target cell. So what do we see? We zoom on into this blood capillary. We know it is a water-soluble hormone because it is moving through the blood without a transport protein. Once it hits its target cell, it's going to diffuse into the interstitium. We're going to bind that hormone. Remember, if it flows easy through the blood, it's not going to be able to slip right into that cell. It needs to bind to the receptor on the cell surface. This is our first messenger. This is going to activate a G protein. This is our second messenger system, which activates adenylyl cyclase. Adenylyl cyclase is going to convert, so again back to second messenger, is going to convert ATP to cyclic AMP, so CAMP. From here, phosphodiesterase is going to inactivate CMP, but before we get to that inactivation, CMP is going to serve as a second messenger to activate protein kinase. Protein kinase is going to phosphorylate cellular proteins. So what happens is ATP is going to pop off a phosphate to make ADP. We get millions of phosphorylated proteins which cause reactions that produce the physiological responses that we require. Now, after here, we need phosphodiesterase to inactivate CMP to essentially shut this system down once the hormone is gone. We're going to finish up mechanisms of hormone actions by discussing how a target cell responds to a hormone. Now, the response is going to be based on a few things. Number one, the hormone's concentration in the blood. Now, remember, if we have high hormone concentration or low hormone concentration, we can downregulate or upregulate accordingly. We can also base this on the number of hormone receptors on the target cell. So again, just a repeat of what we've talked about. We can talk about influences exerted by other hormones. Now, this is interesting because this brings us to a fact, these two words called synergistic effect and antagonistic effect. So, some hormones work more effectively when a second hormone is present to assist them. This is called a synergistic effect. A great example is in males, which is testosterone and follicle stimulating hormone. Now, if only one of these is present without the other, a man can only produce little or no sperm. When both are present, we get a completely different scenario. A male will make roughly 300,000 sperm per minute. So that's a great example of a synergistic effect. The last response is some hormones can oppose the action of others. This is called an antagonistic effect. A great example of antagonistic hormones would be insulin and glucagon in the pancreas. Not to get too complicated, but we'll try to explain this in an easy way. When we have high levels of sugar in the blood, insulin will be secreted to remediate that sugar and allow cells to uptake it, removing it and lowering blood sugar concentrations. Now, on the flip side, the opposite side of this, we have glucagon. When our blood sugar levels are low, glucagon will be stimulated to tap into our sugar stores in our body, our glycogen stores in our body, to release it, to free up sugar and increase blood sugar levels. So again, opposite actions. Insulin decreases blood sugar, whereas glucagon increases blood sugar. So another great example. Control of hormone secretion. Hormones are secreted in short bursts when needed, like a pulsing effect. Now, these secretions are regulated by signals from the nervous system, chemical changes that have been detected in the blood, or release and response to other hormones. We can look at the actions of hormones and put them into two distinct categories. Now, most hormone regulation is achieved via negative feedback loop. And if we go back to our homeostasis definition back in AP1, we know that negative feedbacks are responding to a disruption in homeostasis. Now, again, the majority of our hormone regulation is through this negative feedback. Now, there are only a few hormones that are going to operate through a positive feedback. Now, again, remember, positive feedback is causing a disruption, unlike negative feedback that's responding to a disruption. So again, we are calling for a disruption, causing for a change in homeostasis through positive feedback loops. We can look at the loop to the right of us, and we see that there's a stimulus, there's a disruption in homeostasis by decreasing a controlled condition, which is glucocorticoid levels in the blood. Now, the receptors are neurosecretory cells in the hypothalamus. Their input is increased corticotropic releasing hormone and decreased cortisol. The control center, corticotropes in the anterior pituitary, the output is going to be to increase adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH. This hormone is going to pass through the blood and act on the cells of the zona fasciculata in the adrenal cortex. The response is to increase glucocorticoid levels in the blood, which will in turn allow our body to return to homeostasis when this response brings glucocorticoid levels back to normal conditions, and then we shut the system down. So again, decrease glucocorticoids, so that is the disruption in homeostasis. The response is to detect it, release hormones to act on the adrenal gland to release glucocorticoids and bring our levels back to normal. Now that we went through the details of the endocrine system, our next job is going to be to look at the beginning point, or all the different glands and structures that are going to be regulating and releasing hormones. So our starting point is going to be the brain, specifically the hypothalamus. Now, the hypothalamus is known as the master of all masters, and that's a pretty strong statement. We talk about it being the control center of all other mastery systems, hence master of all masters. So when we talk mastery systems, we're talking digestive, reproductive, respiratory, circulatory, renal. This structure is going to be regulating all these other systems, kind of like the boss of all bosses. So we look at the hypothalamus being the place that is going to be making regulatory, releasing, and inhibiting hormones, as well as two specific hormones that are going to be stored in the pituitary gland. So the next structure would be the pituitary gland. So if we look at the hypothalamus, there is a stalk off the hypothalamus called the infundibulum. On the infundibulum, we're going to find the pituitary. The pituitary is going to be broken up into two lobes. The first being the adenohypophysis, or the anterior lobe. This is the majority of it. It is glandular. It makes up about 75% of the weight of the pituitary, and it makes and secretes 7 hormones. And that's an important distinction, that it is 1, glandular, 2, it makes 7 hormones and secretes them. The posterior lobe is known as the neurohypophysis. So if you notice our root word neuro, so this is an indication that we have some type of neural cells that are regulating the release. So it is not glandular, so that's another key distinction. It is made up of neural tissue and stores and releases 2 hormones that are made by the hypothalamus. So look, big difference between the anterior and posterior. The anterior makes hormones and the posterior does not. It is essentially a storage tank storing the 2 hormones made by the hypothalamus. Now the hypothalamus's main role is secreting, releasing, and inhibiting hormones. These are going to control the release of hormones from the pituitary gland. Now the next question is, well, how do they get there? How do hormones from the hypothalamus reach the hormones in the anterior pituitary, act on the cells that make and release the hormones from the anterior pituitary? And the answer is the circulatory system. So they reach the pituitary gland via, now look, this is an important structure, the hypophyseal portal system. In our next slide, we'll look at some of the pictures of this circulatory system, this network of capillaries that's going to deliver deliver hormones through the blood to the anterior and posterior pituitary. Here's the vasculature of the hypothalamus, specifically the infundibulum and the anterior and posterior pituitary. So let's orient ourselves first. In front, we have the anterior, and in back would be the posterior. So we can say this is our anterior pituitary and this is our posterior pituitary. Again, adenohypophysis and neurohypophysis. So what is the direction of blood flow? So blood flows into the superior hypophyseal artery. It picks up the hormones from the hypothalamus. It moves through the capillary beds down into the anterior pituitary, where it's going to, through this capillary network, the secondary plexus of the hypophyseal portal system, it's going to take those hormones and deliver it through the blood to the body. Again, where are we operating through? We are moving through the hypophyseal portal system, through this hypophyseal portal veins. Again, this entire structure is the system. Now that's only anterior pituitary. We also have to look at the posterior pituitary. So blood is coming in through the inferior hypophyseal artery. It is moving into the capillary plexus of the infundibular processes, and at which point it is picking up all the hormones that is being stored, again, not made, stored in the neurohypophysis, and then delivering them out the hypophyseal veins to be delivered to the body. Hypothalamus and the pituitary gland continued. Let's take a look at some of the cells in the anterior pituitary that are responsible for making these 7 hormones. Now, the 7 hormones we're going to be talking about are going to be, and we're going to write this out here, 1, growth hormone, 2, thyroid stimulating hormone, 3, follicle stimulating hormone, 4, luteinizing hormone, 5, prolactin, 6, adrenocorticotropic hormone, and 7, melanocyte stimulating hormone. So let's take a look at these cells. The first being, we'll highlight yellow, somatotrophs. Now, we'll zoom on into here. Now, the somatotrophs, these cells are responsible for releasing growth hormone in response to growth hormone releasing hormone, or somatocrine from the hypothalamus and are subsequently inhibited by growth hormone inhibiting hormone, also known as somatostatin. Now, both of those are received from the hypothalamus through the hypophyseal portal vein, the hypophyseal portal system, and that secondary plexus. The second cell that we're going to look at are thyrotrophs. Now, these thyrotrophs are going to secrete thyroid stimulating hormone. And we just went through somatotrophs in a little detail. When we get to a table in our subsequent slides, we'll get into a little more detail. Now, our gonadotrophs, now look at our word here, gonads. They're going to stimulate the release of hormones that affect the gonads. This includes follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. The next is lactotroph, so lacto meaning milk. This is going to secrete prolactin. And the last will be corticotroph. So see that cortex? So we're talking about affecting the adrenal cortex specifically by secreting adrenocorticotropic hormone. Now, we see a problem here, right? So let's zoom right back out. We said there are 7 hormones. We just went through 6 of them. The one we're missing is melanocyte stimulating hormone. Now, the area that lies between the posterior and anterior pituitary is called the pars intermedia. So we'll write this in for you, pars intermedia. Now, the pars intermedia is really active in human fetal life. This area is responsible for producing melanocyte stimulating hormone. Now, MSH is going to cause the release of melanin pigment in the skin's melanocytes. Now, the interesting thing about the pars intermedia is that it's either typically very small in adulthood or actually entirely absent. So it's really unknown in adulthood what MSH does, at least alpha MSH. Since we have covered all the parts, we can now put it all together. We start at the top, number 1. These neurosecretory cells are going to secrete, and we'll highlight them for you, releasing and inhibiting hormones. So the green would be releasing and the red would be inhibiting hormones. They travel through the hypophyseal portal system, so right here, and move their way to the anterior pituitary. They act on those cells, those anterior pituitary cells, the somatotrophs, thyrotrophs, gonadotrophs, lactotrophs, and corticotrophs, to stimulate the release of the anterior pituitary hormones. Those hormones move through the hypophyseal vein where they act on their target tissue, glands, structures, etc. Table 18.3 goes over and summarizes everything we've talked about for hormones and cells of the anterior pituitary. Remember, now we're only talking about the anterior pituitary. We deal with the hormones, growth hormone, also known as somatotropin, secreted by, here's our somatotrophs. The release and inhibiting is GHRH and GHIH. And you could go through each and every one of these hormones, what it's secreted by, and who inhibits and or releases them if applicable. Whereas if you take a quick look at FSH, LH, and adrenocorticotropic hormone, they do not have a inhibiting hormone. They are stimulated on a one shot as needed basis and are not inhibited. Again, this table is a great review of everything we've talked about on the previous few slides. We're going to take a look at an example of a negative feedback loop. Now recall, as a review, our negative feedback loops control the secretion of our thyrotrophs, gonadotrophs, and corticotrophs. So what happens here? Corticotropic releasing hormone, CRH, from the hypothalamus is going to travel through the hypophyseal portal system, and it's going to stimulate the release of adrenocorticotropic hormone, or corticotropin. It is going to go to, as its name implies, the adrenal cortex. So it's going to stimulate secretion of cortisol. This cortisol is going to go back. Those elevated levels of cortisol inhibit the release of adrenocorticotropic hormone by the anterior pituitary, by those corticotrophs, as well as stimulate the release of, or inhibit the release of CRH by hypothalamic neurosecretory cells. So again, cortisol overall is the negating factor of what we're talking about here is actually the stress response. Now, as we look at each hormone in of itself and look at its targets, we're going to look at a few things. One, what does the hormone do? Okay, what does the hormone do? And we're going to follow these questions as we travel through all the hormones. Next, what happens, meaning what clinical conditions ensue when the hormone is in high levels or hypersecretion. So we'll say hypersecretion. And then we'll flip the script and say, okay, well, what happens when the hormone is in low? So we're going to kind of shorthand this. What happens when the hormone levels are low? And we'll say it is hyposecretion. Okay, so these are questions we're going to ask, right? As well as what stimulates it, what inhibits it, and what is the overall effect, right? That goes back to number one. So we're going to start with human growth hormone. This is the most abundant and plentiful hormone produced by the anterior pituitary. It's released in these short bursts every few hours, and it's released by those somatotrophs. Now, their activity is controlled by two hypothalamic hormones. Again, remember the releasing hormone, growth hormone releasing hormone, and growth hormone inhibiting hormone. So let's look at a feedback loop for growth hormone. So let's start right here with number one. What's being detected? Hypoglycemia, so low sugar in the blood. We're also detecting decreased blood levels of fatty acids, increased blood levels of amino acids, some sympathetic activity, fight or flight response, possibly deep sleep where we're promoting growth and repair, testosterone, estrogens, thyroid hormones, and ghrelin. Remember, ghrelin is a hormone that tells us that we are hungry. Now, we're going to see growth hormone releasing hormone is going to travel through the hypophyseal portal system, talk to those somatotrophs to secrete growth hormone. Now, that growth hormone is going to travel through the blood system in the body. It'll have a metabolic effect on cells, stimulating overall growth. Who is our target? Liver, bones, skeletal muscle, and cartilage. We get release of these insulin-like growth factors, which will increase growth of bone, muscle, and other tissues. Now, these IGFs are also negative, so high levels of IGF will inhibit or cause this loop to shut down to inhibit the release of growth hormone, also stimulating the inhibition of growth hormone releasing hormone. At the same time, step 5, when we get too high levels, so hyperglycemia, too much sugar, increased blood levels of fatty acids, decreased blood levels of amino acids, obesity, aging, high blood levels of growth hormone and IGFs, we get the opposite response. We get the stimulation of growth hormone inhibiting hormone, which again goes down the hypophyseal portal system and inhibits growth hormone secretion, which kind of negates everything else after here. So that's a nice little example of clinical conditions in the body that can either stimulate the increase of growth hormone or decrease growth hormone secretion. Now, as far as clinical conditions, we are going to look at this in depth in our future slides, but let's introduce a couple terms here. When we have hyposecretion, right? Secretion. We end up with a condition known as achondroplasia. Now, achondroplasia is also known as dwarfism. The second one is going to be hypersecretion. Now, we have two conditions here. One is going to be gigantism, and the second is going to be acromegaly. Now, what's the difference between the two? Now, gigantism is hypersecretion of growth hormone prepubescent. So we're talking about before puberty, where these people tend to be really, really tall individuals, 6'8", 7 foot and taller, whereas acromegaly is a condition of hypersecretion post-pubescent. And again, we'll get into details on what this looks like clinically later on in this lecture. So let's summarize exactly what these hormones do. So we've talked about in detail human growth hormone or growth hormone. Then next is thyroid stimulating hormone. Now this is pretty straightforward, right? Simple, stupid science. This is going to stimulate these cells of the thyroid to produce their hormone. So this is not a one-end target. We are targeting another gland that's going to stimulate and create a new protein that will initially or lead to the creation of hormones that's going to elicit another response. And we'll get into these target glands in a little bit. Next is follicle stimulating hormone. Now these are, remember, coming from gonadotropes, so these are sex hormones. Now it depends on who we're talking about. In females, follicle stimulating hormone does just what its name implies. It deals with maturing and stimulating the growth of the follicle that ovum or that egg is lying in. And then we go through those stages, and at the end of AP2, when we go through reproduction, we'll detail specifically the stages of follicular growth. In males, it's a little bit different. Follicle stimulating hormone works on Sertoli cells. So Sertoli cells are located within the seminiferous tubules, within the testes, and it's kind of like the pause play button, right? So males make an X number of sperm every day. We'll throw a number, it's 500 million sperm every day. And their job actually is to know when to make it and essentially when not to make it. So if we have a full 500 million made for the day, we pause it and follicle stimulating hormone will be inhibited. If a male, say, just ejaculated and the signal to create more sperm is called, then we're going to stimulate FSH to press play on those Sertoli cells to initiate spermatogenesis or sperm production. Luteinizing hormone, again, for females, we're talking about causing the egg to be expunged or kicked out or luteinized from the follicle. So this is the actual popping out of the egg into the fallopian tubes and waiting for it to get fertilized. For males, again, a little bit different. We're acting on cells called Leydig cells. They surround the seminiferous tubules, and these guys make testosterone. Now, here we go with our synergistic hormones where testosterone is needed with follicle stimulating hormone to effectively make enough sperm. So we'll talk about, again, with reproduction, the receptor sites on those Leydig cells for luteinizing hormone and how effective they are making a ton of testosterone, because around age 30 and then 40, 50, subsequently, these free sites, these receptor sites on Leydig cells diminish, which means testosterone levels drop and the ability to make an effective number of viable sperm decreases. Next is prolactin. These act on mammary glands for milk production. Now, I want to introduce something weird here. Now, this is something people have difficulty understanding. So, number one, we're all the same, right? Males and females. We all have the same structures, the same organs, the same glands, secreting the same hormones, just in skewed or varying amounts. For example, males do secrete estrogen and primarily testosterone. Females do secrete testosterone, but primarily estrogen, which brings us to prolactin. So if prolactin is for lactation and milk production, do males have prolactin? The answer is yes, males do secrete prolactin, which brings our next question: can males lactate? And you're probably saying to yourself right now, absolutely not. I've never heard of that or seen it. And the answer is the pause. It's killing you, I know. Yes, males can lactate. What do they need? A stimulus. That stimulus is the suckling of a baby on a teat or a nipple, which will stimulate the secretion of prolactin. But now, wait, you can say, well, then why don't males breastfeed? Now, the dynamics of the breast tissue is a little bit different. While females secrete a sustainative or nutritious type of milk for a baby, males don't. It's more watery and clear and liquidy than it is milky from a female. But yes, they do have prolactin and it can be stimulated. Next, adrenocorticotropic hormone. Look at our words, adrenocortico. So we're talking about the adrenal cortex here. So adrenal cortex. Next is MSH, and we talked about that from the pars intermedia and their effect on melanocytes. Now, table 18.4 summarizes all the principal actions of the anterior pituitary hormone. So again, everything we've talked about, put in a nice, neat little package. You can go through these, but we are going to go through them in depth in a little bit. That brings us to the posterior pituitary, also known as the neurohypophysis. Remember, this is a storage tank. It does not make or synthesize any hormones, but instead stores and releases from these neurosecretory cells, from the axon terminals, two hormones produced by these neurosecretory cells of the hypothalamus are going to be stored in the posterior pituitary. These two hormones are oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. Now, axons from the neurosecretory cells form the hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract. Let's use a picture on the next slide to work through exactly what's happening here. So this is our hypothalamic hypophyseal tract. Notice, and we're going to use green because whenever we draw this in the board or we draw it on a screen, I use green to indicate the nervous system. So we have the cell bodies of the, back to green, the cell bodies of our neurosecretory cells. You can see the axons of these neurosecretory cells traveling through the infundibulum, through the hypothalamus, right? So this is our hypothalamic hypophyseal tract. So all the axons of the neurosecretory cells and their axon terminals in the posterior pituitary. This is what's going to signal the storage and release, subsequent release of those two hormones. So what happens? Let's start with our neurosecretory cells. We follow via two nuclei. Number one, our paraventricular nucleus. This is going to make and move oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone, so we'll follow that pathway down through here and storing it into the posterior pituitary, at which point when it's signaled, it will move through that inferior hypophyseal plexus, the capillary plexus, that will take those hormones, move it out of the hypophyseal vein and to their targets, whether it be the kidneys, arterioles, the uterus, or the mammary glands. We also are going to have, and we'll go back to highlighting, our supraoptic nucleus. Now, its job as well is going to be to make oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. It's going to move it through that hypothalamic hypophyseal tract, move it into the circulatory system, at which point it will be released to target its specific organs. Now, what does each of these two hormones do? Oxytocin is one of our rare positive feedback loop hormones. Oxytocin is released in response to stretch placed on the cervix during childbirth. So, what does this mean? That child is ready to come out. We're ready to deliver that baby. We need to call for a change or a disruption in homeostasis. We're not responding to a disruption, we're calling for a change in disruption. That disruption is going to be to have uterine contractions to push that baby out. Okay, so that's our positive feedback loop. Next, oxytocin is going to affect, number one, the mother's uterus, enhancing contractions. It's also going to affect the mother's breasts. So when that baby comes out, we're preparing those breasts to stimulate milk production by the mammary glands in response to suckling of the baby. The second hormone is antidiuretic hormone. Now, the easy way I tell people to remember this, and then we'll get into some of the details, is think of coffee. Coffee is a diuretic. And what does coffee do? Coffee makes you pee. And the peeing is the elimination of water from your body. So we're removing water from our interstitium, from our body, essentially dehydrating the body. So antidiuretic hormone will be the opposite. It's going to be to conserve water to the body, to rehydrate or hydrate the interstitium, hydrate the tissues, hydrate the body by essentially concentrating urine. So the amount of antidiuretic hormone secreted varies with blood osmotic pressure. So we're talking about the amount of water found within the blood and tissues and interstitium. So antidiuretic hormone decreases urine output, so concentrates urine as part of a negative feedback loop where our osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus monitor blood osmotic pressure. So an increase in blood volume causes a decrease in antidiuretic hormone. So that means our body is well hydrated, our blood volume is pretty good. We do not need to conserve water, so our urine would be pretty dilute. A decrease in blood volume indicates a state of dehydration, which would cause an increase in antidiuretic hormone, which will cause the body to retain more water, ultimately concentrating urine. So when we talk about diluting and concentrating urine, we're talking about the dark yellow-orange color of urine when it's highly concentrated, when your body's in a state of dehydration, or when you're well hydrated, your blood volume is pretty good. That dilute urine, that pale yellow to clear urine that you pee throughout the day. Table 18.5 summarizes the hormones of the posterior pituitary, their hormone and target tissue, what controls the secretion, and their principal actions. Everything we've talked about in the past few slides. We're going to look at some pituitary gland disorders. We've introduced these, and then we're going to talk about them a little more in depth. So pituitary dwarfism, or otherwise known clinically as achondroplasia, is a hyposecretion, so again, hyposecretion of growth hormone. Now, people who suffer from achondroplasia have proportionate bone to muscle tone. They're just significantly shorter because they do not have enough growth hormone to signal these bones and tissues and organs to grow. Now, gigantism versus acromegaly. These are both hypersecretion of growth hormone. What is the difference? Now, again, we wrote this on the other slide. Gigantism is prepubescent, so you have too much growth hormone through your entire life, at birth all the way through development and adolescence. We're talking people who are 7 feet and larger. Now, here's the problem. Remember, growth hormone doesn't really target some of our organs like our heart, our lungs. These people grow really, really big. Their life expectancy isn't very long because what happens, their heart is not able to sustain, there's too much pressure on the heart to sustain adequate blood flow through this extraordinarily large body. The next is acromegaly. This is postpubescent. So after puberty, we get a surge of growth hormone. Now, what happens? The tissues that are still affected by growth hormone, like some of our cartilages, the nose, the ears, the hands, the finger bones, tend to grow bigger. The head tends to grow bigger, while the core, the majority of the skeletal system remains the same. So you get a person, say an average person in the U.S., about 5'9", 5'10", average male. Once he has puberty, say he's 5'9", then all of a sudden a tumor or something stimulates hypersecretion postpubescence, acromegaly. We'll see that their head, hands, nose, ears, feet will grow significantly larger to that of somebody who suffers from gigantism, while the rest of their body remains the same size. So we could take a look at a person, twins, one who is normal and one who suffers from acromegaly. You could look at the hand size. Look at the finger size of the finger bones, how different the bone growth, width and length. And again, look at the size of the hands, almost double in size, somebody who suffers from acromegaly. And we can see the twin here, prepubescent versus after puberty. What happens? Look at the size of the nose, the lips, the ears, the face, the forehead, how much bigger it gets as a result. A picture to show us dwarfism or achondroplasia. So too little growth hormone, again, shortened bones, smaller, but again, uniform throughout all the way around.